it's getting close to about 5 minutes in. So welcome everyone to the IRISE Teach In to Teach Out that we're hosting today to really kind of build around movements that are going on in our community and across the nation, really directing and challenging the Stop the Asian Hate type of grassroots organizing response, to build upon that and to be able to hold space here virtually at the University of Denver and beyond. For some folks that it might be the first time being welcomed in the Teach In to Teach Out space, it started about nearly now 2 years ago in spring of 2019. Students and student activists and faculty and staff that really were looking for a place to be able to kind of center community in an environment at times where folks of color or folks of intersectional identities and background didn't feel like they had a place to really hold space and express their voice and their experiences and perspectives, especially thinking about our students in particular. So the Teach In to Teach Out space has been that space where we acknowledge and anchor this space and being student-centered, not just, I guess, in framing, but in practice, right? And how we can build together as a community across, I guess, like different positions in terms of faculty, staff, and our community members. One way that we would open up this space is to kind of anchor it in an intention. So one, we want to anchor it first of acknowledging the tribal nations and indigenous peoples of the lands that the University of Denver are on, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute lands. Right now, currently, I'm here home with family working remotely. And I do want to make an acknowledge to the Tomba lands and the Gabrielino lands and the tribal nations of the San Manuel, as I'm in the Inland Empire of Southern California as well. So one of the teachings, I think, by anchoring in indigenous epistemology and ancestry is this notion of this sacred interconnectedness to one another. And part of that framing is a framing of to all my relations or to all my relatives. So I want to hold on to that sacred interconnectedness as I welcome everybody. I want to welcome everyone as to all my relations and to all my relatives in this space as we begin to grow and begin to build and reflect on together with one another. So I'll now step back and I'll open the mic up to our panelists and presenters to kind of like then move us forward in the space. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much for having us. So what we agreed on was that I would start off with a general overview of anti-Asian American, anti-Asian racism. And, from there, what Mike and May and I hope to do is to be able to link it up to discussions of how to organize, how to respond in relation to the policy world, by utilizing the university resources or university as an institution and making connections through that, as well as through scholarship, teaching, etc. So yeah, at the end, feel free to ask questions and we'd be happy to have a robust Q&A. Okay, so hopefully I can share my screen and that won't be a problem. I just wanted to share one slide that I use just as an overview. Let's see here. Yeah, just as an overview of the different types of dimensions of anti-Asian and Asian American racism. And the reason why it's so important to specify this and use different examples. I won't be going through all of this. It's a lot, but if you'd like to revisit this during the Q&A, then that's not a problem. But one of the first reasons why it would be important to do is because a question that I often get from Asian American students is, are we even people of color? Okay. And I think one of the very first things we need to establish here is that white supremacy certainly has characterized and positioned us as people of color. We shouldn't have to experience massacres or murders or brutality on the streets to legitimate that we are people of color, because if you look at this history, starting from not just when Asian peoples got to the United States of America, but the US going to Asia as a colonial imperialist power, that all of that was predicated on Asians and Asian Americans as non-white people. Okay. So I say all this to sort of frame some of the exemplars I'm going to use here to really basically substantiate and ensure that you don't feel any trepidation about calling yourself a person of color, seeing Asian Americans as people of color. I have even had professors, Asian American professors, who have been studying anti-Asian racism their whole lives, not feel legitimated in discussing what they're experiencing right now under this COVID-19 Kung flu racism as a certain kind of trauma. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way white supremacy has decided to de-racialize, right? They racialize Asian Americans, but then on the other hand, they'll say, oh no, we de-racialize them, right? Because they're near white, they're honorary white, they're model minorities, right? And that, of course, all of us are grappling with that and internalizing that to some degree, but please note that we are people of color because white supremacy needed to deracialize us or whiten us in order to achieve its own ends of actual white supremacy. Okay, so we can sort of discuss that further later. But so anti-Asian American nativist racism, right? I prefer the term nativist racism, but right now we're often hearing the term white nationalism. The reason why I think nativist racism is more accurate is because in the term white nationalism, the word racism is not present, okay? And as many of you guys have heard, white nationalism is often defined and justified on the basis of, well, we're just talking about Americana. We're just talking about culture. We're just talking about history, right? No, white nationalism is nativist racism, okay? Based on the notion that this is, always was, and should be a white country. And we will get rid of immigrants, we will get rid of Muslims, we will, decry BLM protesters, we will pollute indigenous lands, right? Anything that we need to do in order to achieve the white nation, okay? So the vectors along which Asian Americans have experienced this nativist racism, especially in the form of the forever foreigner, okay, or the foreigner within, the non or not American, right, has been both on legal and sociocultural grounds. So quickly what I'll say for the legal part is that if we think about the laws that we've probably heard a lot about, the exclusion laws, right? And Asian Americans are the group that has been targeted the most and often exclusively by federal legislation to be excluded or banned from the country. And this started happening in 1875 under the Page Law, which stated that Chinese women should be barred from the United States on the premise that they are prostitutes, okay? And they are immoral elements for an America we define as white, pure, and healthy, okay, and moral. Now, the reason why I put this under the virus category is because inherent in that construction of Chinese descent women, and by the way, this law was applied to even Asian descent women who were not Chinese. The assumption is anyone who looks Chinese is Chinese and therefore subject to harassment or legal exclusion, was the notion that because they're prostitutes, they're also bringing in these foreign, exotic, weird, sexually transmitted infections, right, into the United States. Again, defined as pure, white, healthy America. So this is where you start seeing, one of the first kind of formal federal laws based on the notion that Asian Americans are a virus, in this case, women, okay? So using this example, we can also underscore the gendered and sexual bases of the racism against Asian Americans and how that was used to premise the laws. Okay, so then we think about 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is probably more well known, which banned Chinese Americans in general, mostly targeted at male laborers, but also their families. And again, we see that not only is there a gendered component, but one of the reasons why exclusion laws against immigrants were being passed, and especially targeting the Chinese, was because of the view that Chinese people were bringing in diseases, okay, and could, eventually taint or contaminate the racially pure construction of white America, okay? To continue with this virus construction, which I think is important because we mostly only know about it in relationship to COVID-19 or Kung flu racism, right? Hence the title for our talk today, What If Everybody Was Kung Flu Fighting? But when SARS came about, Chinese Americans in the United States were attacked. Okay, so there was a spate of attacks that happened against anyone who looked or could be perceived as Chinese ethnically because of the SARS virus. And then you had the H1N1, and Chinese or anyone perceived as Chinese were also attacked for that, even though the first identified case of H1N1 was actually within the United States itself. Okay, so again, highly racialized, extending from this racialized, gendered, sexualized history against Asian Americans as virus, okay? So if I could just point your attention to the top here, one of the most common ways that scholars and journalists, et cetera, have documented the construction of Asian Americans as forever foreigners is based on an economic threat, and as noted with the contamination or virus threat, it's often sexualized. So one of the first examples I wanted to give of the economic threat, which is also linked to the threat of being a wartime enemy, was the bashing of Japan in the 1980s for its auto industry being highly competitive with that of the United States. And this is in the post-World War II era when Japan is rising as a global capitalist juggernaut. And that is significant because not only were the US auto industry blaming Japan for all the massive layoffs and the economic downturns and the problems, right? It has nothing to do with, our economic policies, right? Or our market and corporate activities in this country. It's always like those people, right? Or those people that come from those countries. And so that is ultimately what led to the brutal murder of Chinese American engineer Vincent Chin in Detroit, who was pinned by a stepson and then by the stepfather, bashed in the head with a baseball bat until he died. Because of the view that Vincent Chin was the reason that they were fired and laid off by GM, okay, in Detroit, right? Japanese or Japs like Vincent Chin, who wasn't even Japanese. And I think it's significant to picture his mother here, Lily Chin, because she devoted her entire life to seek justice for Vincent, whose murderers never spent a full day in jail because the judge decided that, these are upstanding men that had never committed a crime before. So you don't base the sentence on the crime, you base the sentence on their history. Okay. And so there's a famous documentary, if you haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure some of you have, it's called Who Killed Vincent Chin Then, right? If no one spent a full day in jail for his murder. And Lily Chin never got that justice. So she ended up migrating back to China where she passed away. Okay. And we are recently commemorating the birthday of Vincent Chin, who would have been 66 years old this year. And he was murdered on June 2nd. So that's coming up as well. Okay. The anniversary of his murder. There's lots of other examples here, right, that we could go into later if people are interested. I also wanted to bring up the Watsonville riots to mix both economic and sexual threats, as we've seen with the Chinese. So the Watsonville riots happened in Watsonville, California. This was against Filipino Americans who were laborers. And one of the reasons why white American laborers, mostly white American laborers, decided to go on a murderous rampage and pillage the area where the Filipino laborers lived was because not just of the competition that they posed as laborers, right, coming in, but also because of the belief that Filipino laborers were stealing white women from white men, okay, by mingling with them, socializing with them, dancing with them in these taxi dance halls, okay, that was where, you know, they spent their social time after work.
Nadia, I'm not sure if your audio is cut off a little bit. Can folks hear Nadia?
Can't hear you.
Can you guys,
Oh,
let me see here.
I can hear you now.
Oh, you're back.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep, you're
Okay,
back.
you know what? Go ahead and type in the chat box if you can't hear me again for, you know, a sustained period, because I'll see the orange at the top blinking. So I'll know something's up, and then I'll unshare to look at the chat. Okay, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, it must be my connection. The other ones that I'd like to point you to also with regard to wartime enemy, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans without due process of law, without any civil rights proceedings during World War II, based on the notion that Japanese Americans must be somehow supporting the Empire of Japan, right? These aren't Americans, these are the enemies of the state. And despite the fact that over 60% of Japanese Americans were US citizens, despite the fact that there was not a single shred of evidence of any anti-US activities among these Japanese Americans, some of them have been here for multiple generations. They were taken out of their schools, their homes, their jobs, their neighborhoods, and mass imprisoned with state guards at gunpoint. Although we were at war with Italy and Germany as well, Italian Americans, German Americans were not rounded up in concentration camps. Okay, so to understand the anti-Asian specific nativist racism that relied on. I'd also like to bring up wartime enemy, the importance of the South Asian and Asian Muslim community, or people perceived thus, because during the Gulf Wars in the early 90s and then after 9/11, you've seen major spikes in hate violence against anyone perceived as Middle Eastern or Muslim, which includes South Asian Americans and also includes Sikh Americans, who are a totally different religion from Islam. The very first person murdered after the World Trade Center was bombed in Manhattan was actually a Sikh American named Balbir Singh Sodhi. He was gunned down while he was landscaping the gas station that he owned in Arizona, okay? So finally, I think it's important to talk about the refugee threat. There's many other forms of threat, right? Academic threats, being a spy, but the reason why I'd like to highlight this in bold is because I'm not sure how many of you know, but under Trump had changed a long standing agreement between Vietnam, other Southeast Asian nations, and the United States that, you know, at least to some extent acknowledge that because the US waged war over in these Asian countries, that those who are refugees here had a right to stay here, right? And live their lives as Americans, right? But Trump, in an unprecedented maneuver, changed that agreement and decided to start deporting Vietnamese, Cambodians, etc., for minor infractions against the law or for infractions against the law, many of which had already been paid for through jail time, right, and prison sentences, and had been completed. Okay, you know, many of these are actually Vietnamese, Cambodian, etc., American, second generation, the younger generations, right, that lived in inner cities, you know, got involved in gang activity and were serving jail time or had criminal records because of that. Now, not only has Trump been deporting these Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian Americans, but Biden has continued that policy. So again, these are people that have lived in the United States most of their lives, right? US citizens, consider it home, or I'm sorry, on the path to US citizenship, but because of these unprecedented changes and exploitation of loopholes, are currently being deported as we speak. Okay, so forever foreigner. All right, so I just wanted to give some overview of that. And then if there's anything else that we wanted to address later, we can. But I think I'm now, because I've talked a lot now, I'll turn it over to May and or Mike if they just wanted to talk about the ways in which they try to bring their research or their scholar activism in relationship to the university.
I guess I can go first. Thank you, Nadia. That was like a really, you just distilled a lot into a really engaging and important overview. That was wonderful. So I didn't really prepare anything formal. I guess I'll just share a little bit of just my own perspectives. And I really appreciate the way that Nadia set this up, because it really speaks to I think in the moment, the way that folks have been talking about, hate incidents and hate violence, I think, Nadia, you really point to the structural and systemic violence. Because, when we think about, for example, the Atlanta shootings of those 6 Asian massage workers, which was absolutely horrible and tragic, the very same day, 33 Vietnamese folks were deported. And so, I think just like recognizing that hate is beyond sort of individual extremists and also located in state violence, and that we can hold the space for grieving and pain and anger and action, against all those things. So really, really impressed, Nadia, with the one slide. So the prompt, so I'm responding to, I guess I could just share a little bit of my personal story, and also just like challenges, tensions, and how I think this can be productive. So I am a postdoctoral fellow with the Social Movement Support Lab as part of IRISE at DU. And what is really fun and enjoyable and also hard about the work that we do is we support organizations that are essentially working on defunding the police and on divesting this obscene amount of public funds that have been spent on criminalizing, incarcerating, surveilling, and punishing, especially Black and Brown folks, and on reinvesting those funds. And it's a really, it's kind of an extension for me of the work that I was doing before. I finished my PhD in sociology at USC almost a year ago, which is like wild to me. I finished my dissertation in like a month after I found out that I got this postdoc. And a lot of my time was spent there just trying to follow the model of like my mentors, folks like Dr. Veronica Enriquez, Manuel Pastor, just folks I really admired who had come from organizing and really had these models of like thinking about concretely, how can we leverage university resources to really support organizing and movements led by those most impacted by injustice. And the way I tried to do that was really partnering with local organizations. I currently live in Long Beach and I've been working remotely for the past year. And I partner, for example, with an organization called Californians for Justice, which is a cross-racial, youth-led organization that's statewide. And it's mostly, Black and Latinx-led, although it is cross-racial. And so, I just tried to be present, and they have research needs that I could fill, things like, evaluations or like research on how to like shape what their demands were. And they had some, I'll just say personally, like, for folks who are kind of interested in like what this work looks like, there's a lot of tensions, right? Like, especially when you're like in a PhD program, there's a lot of tensions around like publishing or like, what are you supposed to do to like be productive? And sometimes you don't get the advice, like you should do things that like, I know this sounds cheesy, but I really mean it in a sincere way, that like nourish your soul and that like remind you why you're in this and like why you're suffering, you know, like, and you know, like, and being in academia, whether an undergrad or not, is really hard for a lot of folks. Like it's, you know, we know that is a violent institution, especially for like people of color and marginalized folks. And so I don't know, I think just like being with organizations for CFJ, doing like research for them, but also just like being present with them and the youth and just like getting to spend time with them and just be reminded of like what it looks like on the ground to be fighting for change. And, you know, which feels very different than when you're like writing an academic paper and you're like, who's going to read this? Like, is anyone going to read it? Like, will anyone be able to get past the paywall? Like, you know, it feels very different. And it really reminded me of like why I do what I do. And it reminded me that partnerships are critical, not only for building power, but also just like for reminding us how to be human and like redefine social relations, because sometimes that really gets lost in these violent institutions. So that's a long-winded way, I don't know, of saying that, like, yes, it was always important for me to do whatever was needed, whether it was research, giving youth rides, helping young people write college applications, helping plan events, whatever. Like, you know, organizations are really underfunded and under-resourced, and there's all sorts of things that we can do. It could be research, but it could be more. All that to say that, you know, these are also things that may nourish us as human beings, and they did for me. So for me, coming to the Social Movement Support Lab was an extension of that, especially because a lot of the youth organizing in California has necessarily been around pushing back on the school to prison pipeline. I think where this fits into like being an Asian American is, you know, that there are groups, for example, like Combined Girls in Action in Long Beach, and there's, you know, wonderful organizing groups in California that have really been, you know, partnering, working in solidarity, you know, really fighting for broader forms of liberation. There are Asian American communities that I personally am a part of, civic organizations that I've also been a part of that are not on that side, who are pretty like, you know, if you said something like police and prison abolition to them, they would freak out. And there's also, you know, some pretty, active, you know, Asian American activism, unfortunately, that is, I would say, is not on the side of racial justice. There have been folks who, you know, have fought actively against affirmative action in California and elsewhere, even against disaggregation of AAPIs. There's so many different examples and stories. And I think that's all the more, and for me, I think how that's manifested is doing this solidarity work, but also committing to organizing those folks. Because I do get, you know, like messages from my cousins or like folks who are like asking me why I think certain things. And so I really see it as my goal. And I've said this in other spaces, to like be generous and loving and remember that someone taught me and someone helped me along the way. And to try to do that with my own folks and not come at them like, you know, in a hostile way, but try to really remember that's also kind of what I grew up with, those sort of ideologies, and try to bring them along. And it's not easy, but I think it is part of what needs to be done. So let's see. I guess the third piece I'll say about that is like, so, you know, I started this postdoc and it almost felt in a way sort of like a little bit, it almost feels like sometimes those two parts are separate, kind of like solidarity work, even though there are, you know, Southeast Asian folks, South Asian folks, and Asian American folks, you know, fighting against the prison industrial complex, and a lot of folks, but there's, you know, that other part of my life with Asian American folks who are not on that side, and I want to bring them along and bring them together. And so I think actually these past couple of months have brought those two parts of my life together, even in this conversation. And I think those, you know, those contradictions are like where, for example, I feel discomfort is where I feel it's all the more important to bring the lessons from both aspects, even if they felt compartmentalized, into greater partnership. So I think I like went off the rails a little bit there, but maybe I'll just stop there. And then I'll like let Mike talk, and maybe listening to Mike will help me focus future comments.
Well, thanks, May. Thanks for sharing that. And let me start off by first saying thanks, Nadia, for putting all of us into context and having that really wonderful slide it brought me back to Asian American Studies 101 when I was a first year undergrad, and such warm and great memories of learning. And so let me sort of frame it and sort of bring it into connection based on sort of the prompt or the topic of today, right? Which is sort of what's the role of the university or the academy in this type of work. And I'm a professor of education, so I automatically am drawn towards what's the sort of mission of higher education. We're told it boils down to sort of three things, right? Research, teaching, and service. And so in those three components, I often think about how do we engage in this type of work in those three avenues. And certainly with respect to teaching, it is educating and co-constructing curriculum with students in order for us to uncover and talk about what Nadia just showed us, right? The history and kind of trajectory of how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are racialized in the United States. I will also note in your slide there, Nadia, that you had actually a DU alum on there. Michelle Kwan is a alum of the University of Denver. So, and she's a former Olympian and Olympic champion. To my point about the sort of three areas that we're supposed to engage in, and the other is research, right? So we can sort of define our research agenda, working with, of course, our students, other faculty, in order to examine and interrogate some of these social injustices and bring light and I think so many of the wonderful academics here at our institution across the country are giving us new vocabulary to sort of explain or to let us be heard and be seen, right, in our own curriculum, in our own research. So I think that's also equally important. And then lastly is service, right? And May was sort of hinting at this, well, not hinting, talking about the type of service she's doing in connecting her research and her teaching to her community organizing and finding avenues. I hate using this word, these synergies, if you will, these points of connection where she can draw from, where we can all draw from our research and teaching and connect that to what's sort of happening on the ground through community organizing, working with community-based organizations to address social issues, right? And May, I'm so glad you pointed out sort of the how there are, I think we mentioned Asian American Pacific Islanders are unbelievably diverse and complex, and with that, and like all other communities, there tends to be sometimes limited differences between groups. And so we unfortunately have some Asian Americans that are sort of on the other end of the spectrum, if you will, that are trying to dismantle affirmative action or race conscious admissions against data disaggregation. And yet they claim that they are Asian Americans, they are fighting and they're fighting for civil rights, right? I mean, that's literally in the language that they use. And so for me, I often, I think in our work, I often think about how do we, if we're saying we're fighting for civil rights and we're Asian Americans and they're saying the same thing, what's sort of going on there? And I think the way we, I often end up thinking about it is the litmus test is the result racial justice, social and racial justice. If it's not, then you're not really working towards civil rights and sort of claiming a false flag there. So that's sort of the approach that I often think about. But let me say, I don't, a little sort of different from May. I don't do a lot of community organizing with sort of my service. I approach it sort of from a different angle, often from a policy angle. And so I want to share that a little bit because depending on sort of your general interest or how you want to help and contribute to solving some of these social issues, there's a near infinite approaches that you can take, and for me, it's often through a policy making approach. So what that means is, and from my perspective, I think both need to happen simultaneously, right? Grassroots organizing, community-based organizing, as well as pushing our our policymakers to do the right thing. I was once told by a very senior level political operative that essentially when you, engaging with policymakers is essentially trying to get, in some cases, good people to do just the right thing. And so I usually think about that and try to push, and that could mean working with policymakers and legislators, thinking about what data points they need. How do I construct a research agenda that, as May says, gets me the publications I need so I can stay employed, but that is useful for them in advancing racial justice policy agendas. The other is, and so the other, that's in collaboration. The other is to use the legitimacy of the institution that we're at, right? It has a lot of community cachet. A lot of our policymakers were educated at DU here in Colorado. So using that, our roles here on campus in order to, as points of legitimacy to bring new information, to push them to do the right thing. I will say here at most universities, we have at our institution, we have an associate vice chancellor for government affairs. Most schools have someone in that capacity. And that's an office that we could be collaborating with to push new agendas and using their relationships to advance new policy ideas, right? And so part of this approach for me is my background is in public policy. I was a congressional staffer for about 7 years. And so I still maintain those relationships, and I use those in order to push forward, I think, racial justice oriented research agendas in order so that we can make some change, and keeping in mind that if you're drawn towards community activism, community organizing, or the sort of policy organizing, both are long-term iterative commitments, right? We do not expect to see things flip overnight. These take a lot of time, a lot of, oftentimes a lot of tears, and a lot of little wins that you have to be really proud and celebrate in order to keep you going. These are long roads, and certainly not a marathon. I'm sorry, certainly not a sprint, more of a marathon. But I also acknowledge the privilege that we get, all of us here, being a part of an academic system, and regardless of our roles, where we can work towards these efforts, I think is something that I also like to point out. So let me stop there, because I can drone on forever, and maybe toss it back to May or Nadia, or anyone else.
So I guess, so Tom or Johnny, you guys are not moderating, right? So me, May, and Mike are in conversation with each other. Is that mostly? Okay. So, so what I'll probably do is I'll just talk a little bit about my own specific experience of trying to draw on both university and community connections, relationships, resources, and maybe May and Mike and I can have a conversation about, because I'm guessing people here are interested in how do you start, right? How do you get into it? And then what are some of the, I guess, nuggets of wisdom we could share about what has worked, right? Or maybe what hasn't gone the way that we wanted it to go, so that, we could be helpful in this talk today. So one of the first things I'd like to do is just talk about how originally my work really trying to make partnerships between university and social justice, people of color, women, etc. Obviously, the focus is more on people of color. Everything's always racialized in America, right? And the university, we went and we, organized youth in the local Ann Arbor, Detroit area, community members who were anti-racist, pro-social justice, pro-affirmative action. We brought all this organizing and resources to the University of Michigan, but because they knew that some of us were already working with them on their legal Supreme Court case, they absolutely did not listen to anything we had to say. It was a complete waste of our hours and our time. And, so that's an example of what I want to share is something to be very mindful of and careful of when you're trying to deal with an issue that involves both the university, but also not, right? So the university's being sued. We're trying to help the university fight that lawsuit and through the Supreme Court historic decision, maintain affirmative action. But at the same time, we're very unhappy with the way the university is doing that, right? That we don't want to just get into a diversity argument, which is less progressive and less of an indictment of the system of white supremacy, right? And so, that was a major lesson in kind of recognizing that the way we had done it at UC Santa Barbara, even though the cases are somewhat different, obviously UC Santa Barbara wasn't being sued. The UCs weren't being sued at the time, but, you have to really think in the beginning, okay, what are we trying to achieve, right? Will there be conflicts of interest? Will there be a way in which our efforts will be completely diluted or, will be ineffectual, right? Because we're speaking from both sides of our mouth, right? And so, that's just one sort of experience that I can share that, and we can talk about others that helps you as students or organizers or professors kind of understand, when can you be with the university and when should you not be, right? And so anyways, I just wanted to share that and sorry about all the sound issues.
Nadia, if I, since we're on the topic of affirmative action, let me swing it from the other perspective, sort of the and less so from a policy making perspective, but the sort of similar to what you did, a legal approach, and certainly this affirmative action debate is still happening now, right? Asian Americans are intimately involved, all corners of it, with respect to what we're seeing at the case at Harvard, which most likely will make its way to the Supreme Court. And so from my end, I was pretty involved in this lawsuit, but from sort of a different angle, right? Where we said we're not gonna necessarily, we don't work for Harvard, none of us do, and on this little team, and we're not necessarily here to carry Harvard's water either, right, for them, but instead we're here to, because we know that during this affirmative action lawsuit is that there's a ton of misinformation, primarily from the folks who are opposed to affirmative action, sort of perverting the current sort of research, all the research about educational experiences of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and sort of perverting that and twisting it into a way that fits into their narrative and their argument, and using that to then sue Harvard and say that it's because of affirmative action. And so for us as academics, as researchers, as professors, we said, okay, we're going to go in there and correct the record here, and make sure that the courts have a better perspective on, or a more accurate perspective on the educational experiences of AAPIs. And so for us, we essentially we came together and wrote an amicus brief, which is in Latin terms, we're friend of the court brief. I'm sure Tom could share more, could be much more precise in his definitions of this than me, given that I'm not a lawyer. But we came together and essentially put together a literature review of all the education research relating to Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and diversity, and wrote it up, and got 678 other scholars, researchers, professors to join us and sign on to the amicus brief. From there, we submitted it to the courts, and this was as the case was going through its appeals in the First Circuit. And so from that end, not sort of coordinating with Harvard, but going in the approach of saying, look, there's a lot of one particular side is throwing a lot of misinformation out there and twisting the facts. We're here to empirically show you all the research out there and what it really means, and what's actually what the facts and what the research is actually telling us, which is counter to their argument. And from that, actually, we think we were pretty successful in that the First Circuit ended up citing our brief as one of their major arguments. And so in order to rule to maintain and that affirmative action is constitutional and the use of race in admissions is constitutional. So to Nadia's point, it's nice to not have to work in coordination with the university, but to do our own thing and to sort of go in there. Maybe one might argue that we were a neutral arbitrator, right? We just came in and wanted to actually just set the record straight and say that whatever facts were coming from whatever side, or not facts, whatever arguments was coming from the other side, that it wasn't based on fact. And so from that aspect, right, that's sort of, I don't know if it's really policy making, organizing, or activism. To a certain extent, it's some community organizing, because we're going out and reaching out to the community of faculty to sign on to the letter. But it was essentially a 5 of us came together and said, let's write this thing and see how many people will sign on, and then we'll submit it to the court. So that's sort of one way, I think, another avenue where we're using our research skills, our role at the university, at our individual universities, as a mechanism to do this work. I will say, though, that doing that work, I was told by DU's legal counsel that 1, this was on my own time. 2, I could not use university resources for them. And 3, if my name is listed on there, which it was, and that if I put University of Denver, that has to be for identification purposes only. I'm not representing the university in that, right? Which is fine by me. But there's always that little asterisk that has to go by your name in that process, right? Which is the case for sort of everybody. But that's one sort of interesting caveat.
This has been like really, really fascinating hearing both of you share, these experiences and stories. I actually think Mike's point gets a little bit to one of the questions in the chat from Kate Crow about how community organizing and public policy might connect to one another in an inside-outside way. I don't want to take, I guess like I could share just a couple personal experiences. I don't have anything sort of quite as high stature as what my fellow panelists have been talking about. But organizations do need, stuff like what both Mike and Nadia were talking about. And, I think there's a lot of little things that researchers can do, which is like, pulling together, for example, what Mike was talking about, like lit reviews, visualizing data, using it in ways that organizations where when they do go, for example, to Sacramento and do lobby, those are things that, for example, CFJ has used that they say is really, impactful, because young people can take the data and they can own it, right? Like maybe they don't have the time or capacity to do the own analysis, but someone giving it to them, young people can still own and have leadership and be able to employ that data when they're talking to policy decision makers. And that is something that has, is part of their strategy and helps to like sort of further. I hate that we have to do this, right? Because we know that organizers on the ground and folks with lived experience know what's up, but the research does corroborate and sort of help to validate it to those who may not believe in that otherwise. I think something that's a challenge, and I'm curious because as I was hearing Mike talk about correcting misinformation and research and facts, is, one unfortunate thing that I feel like I've learned from 7 years of training to be a researcher is that sometimes, and this goes, maybe this is where organizing illuminates the limitations of research, is that people don't always care about facts. Like, and I think we know this, right? Like, because you can always just say, oh, that's fake, misinformation, it's fake news. And like what organizers, remind us of is just like, a lot of stuff is about framing and just people's paradigms and values, ways of seeing the world. And so for me, that has been like a tension, I think, between being like a researcher and someone who's a part of and supports movements is like, and it's really discouraging, right? Because, I spent, it's like we spent all this time training to do research, and we still do it. And we know it still matters, right? Like, I think, we've heard some really great examples of that. But sometimes it's not enough, sometimes it's not adequate. But I don't know. I wanted to bring that up as like a challenge. And I think, another example of the sort of like policy organizing piece of it is, right now for the Social Movement Support Lab, we're supporting a group in Richmond that I think they're running this really great campaign to allocate funds from Richmond PD to things like support for unhoused folks, mental health crises response, youth employment, advanced peace, which is like really hiring folks from the community who have been formerly incarcerated, experienced gang violence, to interrupt violence, because they're the ones who, know the community best and are credible messengers. And we've been helping them, like analyze the budget, analyze things like what police use their time for. And what's really exciting is just to see people take that and be able to use it in city council meetings to educate and to organize other folks in the community. I think my ideal would be to like be a part of training community members to be able to actually do that, to own the data and to analyze it. But there's not always the capacity or time for folks to do that. And so I think there's, that's like, I guess the flip side, like a positive or exciting example of research being able to be used by folks on the ground to push for policy change.
Can you guys hear me okay right now? Okay.
I can hear you right now.
Yeah, if you can't hear me, you might just want to read the caption on the bottom, because it's an unstable internet connection. My kids are on Zoom school. So sorry if you hear some of these noises on my computer. One thing I did want to add is, and May and Mike have both touched on this in different ways, but, I think part of why also it was important for us to work on affirmative action. I mean, Mike, I'm guessing it's also true of you, but you can let me know, is that Asian Americans have been used since the beginning as the wedge group, right? As the pawn, as the cover to get rid of affirmative action, as if Asian Americans have not and don't continue to benefit from affirmative action policies in jobs, housing, contracting, and in different parts of education, right? So just as a quick example, the University of Michigan sociology department, MA PhD program, in part accepts me because they have very few Asian Americans in the program, right? And so, we have this kind of like monolithic stereotype that Asian Americans have invaded, all parts of undergraduate and graduate education and, all majors and all of that, and that's just not true. And so I think part of why, at least for us, it was so important to get the University of Michigan to use a white supremacy argument, and that there's ongoing racism, is because we have to remember at the time, this is when everybody's saying we're colorblind now, right? Racism's over, right? We don't own slaves, right? We don't need affirmative action, right? That was like the, backlash argument, among the conservatives. And so, and part of that was, look at Asian Americans, right? They're all rich, they're all doing great, obviously talking only really about East Asian Americans for the most part, because, we're the group that they see as the Asian Americans, right? With the, and so it was even more important at that time to, really make our arguments and the justification to support affirmative action about the fact that we have ongoing racist inequality, injustice, white supremacy, going nowhere fast, right? And that we as Asian Americans, right, the very pawns that are used to prove that point, don't believe in what you're saying at all, right? And in fact, see that racial justice for all groups means affirmative action, right? And so kind of connecting back, I think, to the first slide and talking about anti-Asian American racism is that we have to recognize how oftentimes that racism is about disappearing us or invisibilizing us, right? So you can be foreign because you're a visible outsider that doesn't belong and you're a pollutant, right? Or you're a virus or a contaminant. But being a forever foreigner can also mean that you're so invisible and you're so politically and culturally erased that basically we can use you to do whatever we want to maintain the status quo, right? So I think we need to think about racialized foreignness in these multiple ways. And so, for me, and possibly for Mike, I mean, that was why it was so important for me, not
She'll probably be back with us in a second, but my assumption is Nadia's trying to argue that I think that was why it was so important to make sure that, oh, Nadia, you're back.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Mike, keep talking.
No. I was trying to guess what you were gonna say.
Go ahead, guess. You can say it.
Well, no, let me guess and let me know if I'm right here,
Okay.
which is the importance, and based on what you're saying, that's why it was so important to make sure that white supremacy was a major
Yes,
argument
exactly.
of your argument for the affirmative action case. So.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. Were you going to say more? I don't want to interrupt you.
No, that was it.
Okay.
I was just trying to all the time.
Yeah. You guys, we use diversity all the time, right? But the problem with diversity is that usually it's still centering the white American subject, right? Based on the notion that white Americans don't know anything about, ethnic studies or people of color or, empire colonialism, like settler, no, we have to problematize the diversity argument as well. Okay. And I think we're starting to do that more with DEI and with, the George Floyd revolution and all of that, BLM. But, the university, as you know, globs onto the diversity argument. I understand the instrumentalist need for that. But what is the point of having these conversations if we can't reassess, reevaluate, and push the envelope, right? We're talking about more than just, bringing culture to normative America, right? Or multiculturalism to normative America.
Yeah, great point, Nadia. It's more than just, hey, we're gonna have Chinese food in the dining hall today, and so now we're celebrating Asian American heritage, right? It's got to be a lot more complex. And to your point about sort of diversity, today it's hard pressed to find anybody who's against it, right? I mean, I take that back. There's a lot of people who are against it, but I mean, universities. It's hard pressed to find a university to publicly say, oh, we don't want that, right? It's probably on every school's mission statement, but what does that really mean, and how is it sort of operationalized? And with respect to what you're saying about the Supreme Court, right, in affirmative action, if you look at that first landmark ruling for affirmative action, the Bakke case in '78, right, the way the court split up the vote on that, they essentially said, and this, of course, we saw this play out in the Michigan cases, the Grutter and Gratz cases that you talked about, is that, the argument for affirmative action, and the reason why we have it is because we know there are educational benefits to diversity. And so again, it centers whiteness, right? It's saying that we need schools to be diverse so that white students can gain the educational benefits to diversity on the labor of people of color, and so that because of that sort of legal argument, it's sort of a tough thing for us to argue and for us to work with. And so yes, we have to problematize what diversity really means and what we mean when we say the educational benefits of diversity and all of those arguments. Otherwise, we're not centering justice in that work. I'm hearing this new term though, instead of DEI or whatever, people are saying.
You guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
So I'm saying I'm hearing this new term being used now, and partially it's because I'm a big Star Wars nerd, but some schools are starting to say Jedi, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, making sure that the word justice is in there. That's just not about that, and of course it's Star Wars related, and that makes me very, very happy. So maybe that's something that we need to begin to sort of helping reframe the diversity argument and make sure that the word justice is included in there too.
That's awesome. I've never heard that. That's great. Yeah. May, did you want to say something or?
No, not at all.
One thing I just wanted to add to Kate's question, yeah, about community and public policy sort of partnerships or relationships. I can now kind of think about my work with the Asian and Latina immigrant activists in Los Angeles who are fighting for environmental justice, right? They're fighting against environmental racism, against environmental classism that disproportionately pollutes their air, their communities, their neighborhoods. And, right now, I think we're in an interesting debate amongst activist scholars and between university and community partnerships about should we be relying on rights? Should we be relying on the state, right? Or should we kind of follow more of the Grace Lee Boggs, Scott Kurashige, and similar models, right? Whereby we recognize that the state has ultimately, especially under neoliberalism, like we talked about before, has ultimately abandoned marginalized people, okay, and serves the 1%, right, the war machine, etc., and has abdicated their commitment to the social safety net, the social welfare state, right, and therefore communities of color, marginalized communities of all kinds, intersectionally oppressed, should be focusing on forging their own communities, right? Their own, and we're having this conversation in relation to, as May discussed, defund the police, right? Rather than having a state arm called law enforcement and the police, that you have community policing, right? That you have, groups or patrols of social workers, right? And public health workers and emergency responders that come out and do the work of helping and uplifting the community, so you don't have police killing and shooting people with mental health needs, people that are disproportionately people of color, houseless, et cetera, right? And so that would be an example of what this model is aspiring for, right? Like you form your own community, security, patrols and social supports. You provide each other that social support that the state has abandoned, right? For the market, for capital. And so I feel like the immigrant activists that I worked with were kind of like having to navigate and vacillate between those worlds, because I think in the abstract, it's an amazing concept, right? I don't always think it can actuate on the ground, right? Actualize on the ground. So what I mean by that is that the Asian, which are mostly Filipina, and the Latina, which are mostly Mexican immigrants that I worked with, they really were not that interested, especially the Latinas who are mostly undocumented. They were not that interested in, the voting at the federal level, running for office, like focusing on the policy world. What they were most focused on is, I want to get our local municipal governments, right, and the state, right, the state legislature in Sacramento, and if need be, the federal government can come in to, cut down on the pollution, right, from the oil refineries, from the freeways, from the ports that run on diesel spewing ships, right, many of which come from China, right? I want them to not place any power plants next to my house, right? I don't want them to expand the freeway. I want them to bring air filters into my children's schools where they're coughing and suffer from asthma, and so they kind of had this interesting relationship where I do believe that they're organizing, victories are few and far between in social movements, but I do think that their organizing really helped establish some of the policy victories, right? Because they really got in the faces of their local reps, the local government and Sacramento whenever they had to. They made them look like cold-hearted, stone-faced like automatons, you know. They brought in their children, they cried, they used emotional politics, right? The politics of care, right? And so then you have things like Metro, Caltrans in LA deciding, okay, we won't expand the freeway right now. And there may have been other decisions for that, right? But you cannot discount the work of these community organizers, right? They decided the port, in an unprecedented move, decided to do a clean trucks program, right? Because it's a lot of those trucks that ship our tchotchkes and our cars and our clothes, right, from those.
Now one of us has to try to decide, predict what Nadia was going to say, but I have no idea. Nadia.
Oh, okay. Okay, go ahead. Someone else talk. Someone else talk.
No, I really wanted to hear what you're going to say. And I was like, I don't know what she's going to say. So.
Can you hear me now or no?
Yeah, it kind of ended a little bit after you're talking about the tchotchkes.
Not tchotchkes. Okay, yeah. So you can read on the bottom too. I hope the caption captures what I'm saying. But so, you know, on the one hand, they were able to really use all those different strategies that I just mentioned to get the state that ultimately doesn't really care to pretend that they care, right? At the same time, they're not so focused on political assimilation and about, you know, oh, I have to get citizenship because I need electoral level or formal political power, right? They weren't so hell bent on that. And, you know, to some extent, I think while that might not give them the cachet in terms of, oh, politicians are going to listen to everything they say because they're going to vote, right? But it did give them the cachet to force these elected officials to pass some of these laws and make some of these policies because they spent and focused so much of their effort on galvanizing the community, right? Galvanizing youth organizers, right? And that is where, you know, you might not have pressure based on, oh, they're my voting constituent, I better do what they ask. But you can make wins, right? Even sort of more divorced from the state and the formal electoral realm by virtue of really going full throttle with the grassroots community organizing. So I just, you know, there's connections and lack of connections that I think are fruitful, right? Okay, I'm done.
Nadia, if I may jump in, yeah, I think what you eloquently put out is like a lot of this is movement building work.
Yes.
And I think like you talk about those victories that we build on, whether they seem more institutional, more state sanctioned and stuff, but then there's the transformative power that just happens when our community members, these ladies, these women that, you know, their identities and everything are somehow designed to be marginalized or silenced, but then they activate power.
Right.
And they activate a pushback that then gets passed on and begins to be part of like an essence in the community. And I think, you know, kind of sharing in a similar background with May too, doing a lot of youth organizing and youth empowerment work. Like, I think a lot of our young folks might be at that table where they're thinking about, let's have the reimagine, let's envision what we want and start creating those alternatives. But I think that for us to get there, I think our youth and stuff, we're always needing to see some of those examples to continue to reaffirm that movement building type strategy.
Yeah, so it can actually go somewhere.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Whether it might not seem at the present, but we're laying the movement, we're building towards the fact that we're going to have those conversations of, yes, there's one direction we can go to hold and pressure the state to be accountable. Then there'll be another direction that we'll be on too, where we'll activate our own power to create our own spaces, like our own kind of protocols, our own agreements, where that self-determination and autonomy starts to rise. So that's what keeps me inspired in working with youth, because I think a lot of times our youth are still open to that idea of kind of like, you know, for the lack of a better term, if it's the whole like do it yourself or the whole little hack or however, you know, they're always looking at different ways to not do things so traditional and formal, but to keep put the tools in their hands and start to try to do some stuff. So I see both complement each other and increasing open power on both sides.
Yeah.
I just want to add, Nadia, I know I got to read and cite your book because my whole dissertation was about just like emotional politics. And I think to Johnny's point, it's totally right that what groups do, what some folks call prefigurative politics, the ways that we try to prefigure and enact the society that we want to see in our social relationships with each other, also inform the types of systemic change they enact. Like, for example, Californians for Justice, like they did a lot of stuff around school funding, and they're still doing it. But I think, as they started to realize, like movement building work is hard, right? Like people get burnt out, it's exhausting, like, decision makers are not always the nicest people.
Like, no resources.
Right. Mike said it's a marathon. Like, and we have to really cultivate these spaces of joy, especially, and I think young people really do that so much better than adults. They're like, yes, organizing needs to be fun. Like sometimes I don't want to go to a meeting because I'm tired. Like I spent all day working. I'm gonna go to the meeting and do more work. Adults need to have fun. And that's one thing we can really learn from youth organizing is just that joy and Khmer Girls in Action. Exactly. I love effing around. Khmer Girls in Action, I think they have such a good philosophy around this. And the ED, Leanne, talks about just activating all the senses, I guess the point I was trying to make was CFJ, as they started to move towards, recognizing that we need to engage in transformation in all levels of what we do. I think that actually informed really expansive and creative campaigns because after the education, after the funding stuff, they had students do this whole survey, and to the adults' surprise, students said the most important resource for students of color in school is a caring relationship with adults. And the adults were like, oh, so floofy, so touchy-feely. But that's what students were speaking to is we have this foundation of just needing someone to care for us. And obviously there's a systemic neglect of Black and Brown students that is both resource-wise and affective and emotional. And that shaped their whole campaign, and it pushed adults to move towards a really creative campaign around entirely re-envisioning schools. And I think Khmer Girls in Action is amazing at this, really just connecting all those different levels. And Nadia, as you're talking, there was something that Leanne had said the other day that I wanted to share back, but now I can't remember what it was. But I think and the other thing about just the political power piece, she told me KGA doubled the Southeast Asian vote in Long Beach. And that is because of, them bringing together all these different elements of organizing. And they have this approach called integrated voter engagement that brings together the grassroots and the electoral organizing. And I think these groups in California are doing an amazing job of building electoral power in a way that always reminds folks that it's not just about voting, but that also, in voting and getting others to vote, we're carrying our community members who can't vote, who are structurally barred from voting. And so there's just such amazing work going on locally. And I know we can't talk about California stuff. Sorry to you folks. But such amazing, I think, examples.
Well, I'll add to that and just say here in Colorado, similar things are happening, right? So there's a first ever, it's in the emerging process now of individuals within the AAPI community, as well as folks who work at community-based organizations on behalf of AAPIs, as well as other types of, like the Colorado Health Foundation. Their senior staff who are Asian American, identify as Asian American Pacific Islander, coming together to create this coalition to create, that's community organizing, but to create different forms of political power to advance the agendas for our communities here in Colorado. And so and that's beginning to form, and we're looking at other models in other parts of the country where it's sort of these pan ethnic or pan racial or pan organizing organizational networks are being built. And so there's a lot of exciting things happening here too, right? For folks who are interested in being involved. And so but I recognize the great work in California, given that I am a former Californian. That is very hard to say, by the way. But
You're always one of us. Yeah, Johnny, and just to piggyback off of what you said and what all of you are saying, I think part of what these immigrant, activists recognize, mostly women, is that it was by virtue of really focusing on the building of relationships, right? On the building of networks in the community, that not only was what allowed them to marshal power to influence the state and corporate agents, right? And institutions, but it was also what is starting to allow them to have that community reliance on themselves, right? Like as communities, the networks that they form, the people they get to know, right? So that the state not only doesn't help us, right? But they're trying to exclude us and deport us, right? And so they absolutely need, that internal community sort of solidarity, right? And their communal resources to survive in this very neglectful neoliberal, we want to just get rid of you, deport you age, right? So, it kind of serves all of these.
You're out, and I don't think it gets the caption gets you. You might be back now.
Am I back?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'll just be unback, in 2 seconds. But anyways, no, so I was just saying that, I think that we're starting to see more examples and more models of, what, the Bogsian tradition, right, is trying to teach us. And even seeing, as we're discussing, the ways in which sometimes you have to navigate the two, sometimes they're in opposition to each other, sometimes you can make them complementary, right? So, yeah.
Well, I think we're pretty close to time, right?
Yeah.
For the workshop. Okay, so so I'm not sure if folks are coming. The panelists want to put maybe their emails like in the chat, or figure there's a best way to reach out, like if they have any like any further questions, maybe, or like follow-ups they'd like to do. One of the things that I'm really hearing, like at that last point, Nadia, you were making too, is just the power of the solidarity work. And the recognition of just like, ultimately we're having these conversations and creating these spaces because our liberation and our fights for freedom and rehumanization and a re-envisioning of the world we want is based and interconnected to one another. So, I definitely think that these spaces are in that spirit. And again, looking to our community and all through all the different stories, like going back to the old school Prop 209 organizing days, and even some of like, the contemporary stuff that's happening here in Denver now, and some of the stuff that was happening out in California, is, again, it just kind of reaffirms that hope that this is the direction that we're going in, and that our power has always been in that solidarity and really, being accomplices to one another, going beyond just being an ally, but figuring up that next step and how to really move towards action and supporting one another. So unless y'all have any final thoughts, if y'all want to close.
I'm so impressed by this California connection among all four of us. But you guys did bring up Denver, so that, that's important. But yeah, I think that was accidental, Tom. I don't think it was deliberate. Yeah, so yeah, if people yeah, I don't think we have time for more questions, unfortunately, but yeah, they can contact us, and we'd be happy to respond.
Okay, y'all. Well, everyone, take care. Blessings. Be on the lookout with IRISE and the Teach Out to Teach Out to see if there was going to be one more this quarter. If not, continue to follow like on the website. And please, everyone, be safe and in good health as we roll out and wrap up the quarter. Take care, y'all. Blessings.
Plug. One more. Next Thursday, I forget the time, but me and my colleague will be talking about the limitations of hate crime legislation.
Awesome.
Okay, y'all. So be on the lookout for that.
Next Thursday.
Take care.
All right. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.